Esta noche, el precandidato liberal Luis Carlos Galán Sarmiento fue víctima de un atentado terrorista cuando presidía una manifestación política en Soacha, aquí muy cerca de Bogotá.
Politician Luis Galán is murdered as he approaches the platform to give a speech. He is only the latest in a series of murders.
August 7th, 1986, when President Virgilio Barco Vargas and his would-be successor, Cesar Augusto Gaviria, started a war with the cartel, little did they know it would be a bloodbath. Thousands were killed, an airplane was bombed out of the sky, cities were destroyed, and even a presidential candidate, Luis Carlos Galán, was assassinated. We got some times when presidents were messing with the wrong cartels and suffered devastating consequences.
Once word gets out that El Chapo's son has been detained by the Mexican security forces, all hell breaks loose.
On October 17th, 2019, Mexican security forces entered the city of Culiacán, Sinaloa to carry out a high-risk operation. Now, their target was Ovidio Guzman Lopez, one of the sons of El Chapo and a rising leader within the Sinaloa cartel, specifically its Los Chapitos faction. The operation had been approved by President Andrés Manuel López Obrador, known widely as AMLO. At the time, he'd been in office for less than a year and was facing growing pressure from the U.S. to arrest and extradite major cartel figures. Ovidio had been formally requested for extradition due to charges of trafficking methamphetamine and fentanyl into the U.S. That arrest would prove to be a big mistake. The mission was supposed to be swift and surgical. Mexican National Guard and military had received intel that Ovidio was staying at a house in a residential neighborhood of Culiacán. Around 2:30, forces moved in and successfully arrested him. At first, it seemed under control. Ovidio was in custody, he was surrounded by armed personnel, and under federal authority. Now, the government thought it was a major success, and that they would demonstrate their ability to respond to international demands while still maintaining national order. Well, that moment of control didn't last long. Almost immediately after the arrest, armed members of the Sinaloa cartel launched a large-scale counterattack across the city. They arrived in coordinated units, many of them carrying military-grade weapons, including .50 caliber machine guns and rocket-propelled grenades. Some vehicles had been turned into armored tanks. The cartel gunmen had blocked major roads by setting fire to public buses and cargo trucks, isolating the government forces and cutting off any planned escape routes. Gunfire began to spread throughout many neighborhoods, and heavily armed cartel fighters established control over key points of the city. In a further escalation, cartel members began taking hostages, as some of these hostages were family members of military personnel, used to pressure the government into releasing Ovidio. The cartel had launched a successful prison break, releasing dozens of inmates from a local jail to create additional chaos and confusion. The situation would quickly spiral into an urban conflict far beyond what the authorities had anticipated. So by late afternoon, Culiacán was under siege. Civilians ran for cover, businesses closed, schools went into emergency lockdown, smoke from burning vehicles would fill the streets. Videos on social media showed open gun battles between cartel members and security forces. Residents filmed from their homes, documenting a city overwhelmed by organized violence. The cartel's message was clear. If the government did not release Ovidio Guzman, they would continue to escalate. Inside the federal government, officials held emergency meetings. President López Obrador remained in Mexico City and was in constant communication with his security cabinet. They were faced with an extremely difficult decision. Continuing to hold Ovidio could lead to a much higher death toll, including innocent civilians caught in the crossfire. Sending in more military could turn the city into a battlefield. So after weighing these options, the president and his advisors decided to release Ovidio to stop the violence. At around 7:30 p.m., just 5 hours after his arrest, Ovidio Guzman was released. The cartel achieved its objective, and the federal forces withdrew from the city. The Mexican government confirmed the release shortly after it happened. The decision was described as a necessary measure to protect lives, but public opinion immediately turned against the administration. The consequences were immediate. At least 8 people were killed during the day's fighting, including civilians, members of security forces, and cartel gunmen. More than 20 people were injured. The streets were damaged, filled with burnt vehicles, shattered windows, and the remains of the battle. The operation, which had started as a confident move against a major cartel figure, ended in a complete reversal. The event became known across Mexico as the Culiacanazo. Criticism came from all around Mexico, inside and out of the political spectrum. Many described the decision as an act of surrender. Some critics accused AMLO of showing weakness or even implied that he had sympathies with the Sinaloa cartel. The operation also damaged Mexico's standing with the U.S. authorities. The DEA and other agencies in the U.S. had been pushing for Ovidio's arrest, so when they saw him released within hours, well, their reaction was one of frustration. Although the U.S. government didn't issue direct criticism, officials privately expressed concern over Mexico's ability to control cartel violence and follow through with their bilateral commitments. The failure of the operation was linked to a number of problems. Intel reports had failed to fully assess the risk of retaliation. The arrest was rushed, reportedly to meet U.S. pressure, without the preparation needed for such a high-value target. The security forces that carried out the mission were never given proper backup, and more importantly, the government had no contingency plan for a cartel counterattack. The idea that Ovidio could be arrested without serious resistance turned out to be a major misjudgment. Now, the broader issue was the president's approach to cartel violence. He believed that reducing poverty and corruption would cut the power of the cartels over time. However, this long-term strategy didn't account for the immediate threat posed by groups like the Sinaloa cartel. In moments of confrontation, such as the Culiacanazo, the state appeared unprepared, and the government quickly realized that they'd messed with the wrong cartel. Ovidio Guzman was free for 3 years after that failed arrest, but the government eventually moved again. On January 5, 2023, Mexican forces launched a new operation in Culiacan. This time, the mission was better organized. Ovidio was captured again, and the violence was pretty intense. At least 30 people died, including 10 soldiers. Cartel fighters once again responded with force, setting off another wave of violence in the city. The second arrest was seen by some as an attempt by the government to regain its credibility, but it also reminded the public of how much damage had already been done during the 2019 operation. The president defended his original decision, insisting that it had been necessary to prevent more bloodshed. He stated in a press conference that the government didn't want war, and that protecting civilian lives was the top priority. The Culiacanazo stands today as one of the most serious security failures of AMLO's presidency. It exposed the strength and organization of the Sinaloa cartel, and showed the limits of strategy based solely on de-escalation and social programs. It would also raise new questions about the ability of the Mexican government to enforce the rule of law in areas controlled by criminal groups.
Mexico's President Felipe Calderón says he'll continue using the full force of the state to rid the country of drug violence. But powerful drug traffickers here are fighting back.
December 1, 2006, Felipe Calderón officially became president of Mexico. The ceremony would mark the beginning of a new administration. But even before taking the oath of office, Calderón was aware that he was inheriting a country under siege. His vow to fight the cartel would be a huge miscalculation that would lead to many deaths. Now, at the time, these crime syndicates had grown far beyond typical criminal groups. Drug cartels now operated as parallel powers, but they were even more terrifying because they were often better armed, better funded, and more feared than the state itself. Just look at their improvised APVs and how serious they were. Cities along the U.S.-Mexican border were controlled by drug traffickers, still are. Rural areas had been converted into smuggling routes and poppy fields. Even some urban centers had become nests of cartel operations. Calderón was a lawyer trained in Mexico and at Harvard, and was known for his determination and confidence. He belonged to the National Action Party, and he promised to restore law and order across the country.
I say this is a fight of all Mexicans, because criminals don't discriminate. They hurt all of society. That is why your participation is vital.
But this wouldn't be a normal fight against crime. As a result of Calderón's declaration of war, criminal organizations embedded within Mexico's economy, institutions, and security forces were faced with an open confrontation. Just 11 days after taking office, December 11, 2006, the president would launch what became known as Operation Michoacán. More than 6,500 federal troops and police were sent into Michoacán, a state known for its rugged terrain and strong cartel presence. Now, the area was controlled in part by La Familia Michoacana, a violent religious-themed cartel that would use torture, extortion, and public executions to impose control. It was no longer safe for residents to speak freely, and even local police had been compromised. Calderon's move was unprecedented. It was the first large-scale use of military force in the modern fight against organized crime in Mexico. Tanks rolled into towns. Soldiers set up roadblocks. Entire neighborhoods were placed under surveillance. Calderon said this was a fight for Mexico's sovereignty, and he believed the state had a duty to reclaim its authority. But this show of strength didn't really scare the cartels. Instead, it just escalated the violence. Rather than backing down, these criminal groups expanded their arsenals, fortified their networks, and began responding with brutal force. Now, the Sinaloa cartel controlled a vast portion of drug trafficking routes into the U.S. The Gulf cartel had deep ties in Tamaulipas and used bribery and terror to maintain its grip. Then came Los Zetas, perhaps the most violent of them all. Formed by Mexican special forces who defected, Los Zetas operated more like a militia than a drug gang. They were trained in combat, equipped with heavy weapons, and skilled in urban warfare. By attacking these organizations, Calderon wasn't just taking on any criminal here. He's challenging powerful, organized groups that were ready to fight back. And as you can expect, things were about to get pretty ugly. In 2007, the federal forces extended their reach across the country. The military was deployed to major hotspots like Tijuana, Ciudad Juarez, and the state of Sinaloa. Calderon chose to bypass many state and local police units because these forces were often infiltrated by cartel ops. Military choppers flew over mountains looking for drug labs. Marines would storm safe houses near the coasts. Cocaine shipments were seized. Some cartel members were arrested. Now, there were few early successes, and Calderon's government promoted these victories in the media, but with every advance came a new wave of violence. Cartels retaliated by attacking soldiers, police stations, and civilians. Public executions and kidnappings rose sharply. In May 2008, the drug war had entered a new phase of violence. Edgar Eusebio Millán Gómez, the acting head of Mexico's federal police, was assassinated outside his own home in Mexico City. 8 bullets fired at close range. The attack was traced back to the BLO, who had recently split from the Sinaloa cartel. That message was pretty clear. The cartels can now strike anywhere, even in the capital, even at the heart of federal law enforcement. So Calderon responded by strengthening ties with the U.S. He secured cooperation through the Mérida Initiative, an agreement that brought hundreds of millions of dollars in American funding for training, intelligence, and technology. Mexico received aircrafts, surveillance drones, and advanced wiretapping equipment. Now, these tools gave federal forces more firepower. They also pushed the cartels to become more flexible, more decentralized, and more brutal. Essentially, things were going from bad to worse, and this was only the beginning. In March 2009, federal authorities arrested Vicente Zambada Niebla, the son of Sinaloa cartel co-leader Ismael El Mayo Zambada. Niebla was known for his extravagant lifestyle and was seen as the next generation of Sinaloa leadership. His arrest was a significant blow to cartel operations, and he was eventually extradited to the U.S., but the result wasn't stability, it was chaos. In retaliation, El Chapo's gunmen launched attacks across the region. Grenades are thrown into police stations. Gunmen are setting up roadblocks and executing officers on camera. At this point, the president was probably regretting starting this war with the cartels, as that death toll was piling up. And later that year, on December 16, 2009, Navy commandos would track and kill Arturo Beltran Leyva in a high-profile raid in Cuernavaca. They flew a chopper gunship right over his house and rained armor-piercing bullets down on him. The guy stood no chance. Now, his death was hailed as a major victory and was widely covered. The operation triggered violent infighting, each more desperate for control. In Morelos and Guerrero, cartel-related murders surged. Communities found themselves caught between rival groups fighting for territory the Beltran Leyvas once ruled. Then came another major blow. On July 29, 2010, the Army kills Ignacio Nacho Coronel, a top Sinaloa commander, and one of its main traffickers of methamphetamine to the U.S. Coronel's death disrupted operations in western Mexico. However, he created a vacuum, which led to the rise of Jalisco New Generation Cartel, better yet known as CJNG. Now, this was a group that would later become one of the most dangerous in the country, even today. Each cartel leader taken out led to more instability, and as one head was cut off, several others appeared, like fighting an immortal Hydra. The violence wasn't limited to Mexico. On March 13, 2010, in Ciudad Juarez, 3 individuals connected to the U.S. consulate were killed. The attack now shocked the American government and reminded the world that the drug war wasn't only a local conflict, it had regional consequences now. Ciudad Juarez Juarez, which was once a bustling city, became a war zone. Businesses shut down. Residents fled. The death toll rose so fast that morgues were unable to keep up. So Los Zetas now expanded their reach during this time. They started using car bombs, mass executions, and coordinated attacks to take over cities like Monterrey. In many cases, the feds found themselves outgunned. Cartels infiltrated the police, recruited military deserters, and used intelligence leaks to avoid raids. Allegations of human rights violations by the military would also increase. Civilians were now tortured, detained without trial, and sometimes killed in operations gone wrong. Trust in the government began to erode. The entire campaign this president had started was now a full-blown nightmare that he couldn't wake up from. And by 2012, as Calderon's 6-year term came to an end, the official death toll from the drug war had surpassed 80,000. Entire families had been displaced. Journalists who reported on cartel violence were assassinated. In some towns, local governments had to simply stop functioning. Calderon defended his actions, though. He said the state had to take a stand, and that failing to act would have allowed the cartels to just dominate Mexico completely. But many critics disagreed. They claimed this strategy was flawed. The enemy was underestimated, and the human cost was too high. But you know, as deadly as this cartel war was, it's nothing compared to the next one.
Esta noche, el precandidato liberal Luis Carlos Galán Sarmiento fue víctima de un atentado terrorista cuando presidía una manifestación política en Soacha, aquí muy cerca de Bogotá.
Politician Luis Galán is murdered as he approaches the platform to give a speech. He is only the latest in a series of murders.
By the end of the 80s, Colombia was in a crisis. The streets of its major cities, particularly Medellin and Bogotá, were controlled more by fear than by law. At the center of everything was the Medellin cartel, led by Colombia's most wanted man, Pablo Escobar, a man who used violence and corruption in equal measure to build one of the most powerful drug empires the world had ever seen. And the war between the Colombian president and Escobar was simply a horror show. In his prime, Escobar didn't just deal with cocaine. He dealt in influence, threats, and murder. He bribed politicians, killed judges, and bombed airplanes. The government, the judiciary, and even the military were deeply penetrated by cartel money and threats. Into this chaos steps Cesar Augusto Gaviria, a technocratic economist turned politician who would soon become the face of Colombia's war against the cartels. It wasn't a fight he chose, but a battle forced upon him when Escobar declared open war on the Colombian state. What followed was a violent struggle between a democratically elected president and a drug lord who made himself head of state. Gaviria didn't just face criminality. This guy faced a criminal regime with its intel network, armed forces, and a terrifying willingness to kill. Even before Gaviria took office, the tone of his presidency was set with blood. On August 18, 1989, Luis Carlos Galán, a popular presidential candidate and a leading voice against the cartels, was assassinated during a rally in Soacha. This guy campaigned openly against drug trafficking and promised to extradite narco criminals to the U.S., something Escobar just couldn't have. And the murder was not just an attack on one man, but a message to an entire political class. Anyone who stood against the Medellin cartel would pay with their life. Galán's death was felt all throughout Colombia. Public anger exploded. Political parties are now forced to react, and the Liberal Party chose Cesar Gaviria, Galán's campaign manager and closest advisor, to replace him as their candidate. Gaviria narrowly escaped death himself months earlier when Escobar bombed Avianca Flight 203 in November 1989, mistakenly believing Gaviria was on board, and the crash killed all 107 people on the plane. Gaviria luckily changed his travel plans at the last moment. Escobar had missed his target, but he was showing how far he was willing to go. From the beginning, Gaviria knew that a conventional law enforcement response was not enough. He needed international help, especially from the U.S., which was deeply concerned about the flow of cocaine into its cities. The U.S. provided money, military training, intelligence, and technology. In return, Gaviria's government agreed to fight back harder than any administration before it. He created the Search Block, a special police unit tasked exclusively with hunting down Escobar. Unlike other Colombian forces, which were were riddled with corruption. The search block was carefully selected, closely supervised, and directly supported by U.S. advisors and DEA agents. It became the tip of the spear in the fight against the cartel. But Escobar didn't go quietly. As the government would close in, the violence escalated. Throughout 1990 and 91, Colombia experienced some levels of violence that would shock even those used to years of political instability. Escobar sicarios, these young assassins trained to kill for just a few $100s, gunned down police officers daily. Entire city blocks were destroyed by car bombs. Again, journalists are killed, judges executed, political candidates disappeared. Escobar offered cash rewards for anyone who killed a cop. And by the end of 1991, over 500 officers had been murdered. So now faced with this kind of chaos, some in Colombia began to call for a negotiated solution. Escobar knew how to exploit this desperation. In 1991, he surrenders to the government under terms that were heavily criticized. He said he'd turn himself in, only if he could avoid extradition, and then be housed in a prison of his design. That prison, known as La Catedral, was in no way built or operated like a prison. This was a mansion on a hill where Escobar continued to run his operations, host guests, and even order hits. Gaviria believed that this arrangement might at least reduce open violence while weakening the cartel's leadership from within. It was a gamble, and it failed. So on July 22, 1992, when the government tried to move Escobar to a real prison, he simply walked out the back door. The embarrassment the president suffered from this was total. Gaviria's administration had allowed the most wanted man in the world to build and escape from his jail. But rather than step back, Gaviria used the moment to restart the war with even greater intensity. The search block was reorganized, better armed, and now given new authority. The U.S. had increased intel sharing, and raids on Escobar's associates became a daily event. Over time, Escobar's world shrank. His lieutenants would either be captured or killed, and his wealth was drained. His family was put under pressure, and he had nowhere left to go. He tried to fight back by ordering more kidnappings, more murders, and more chaos. But the tide had turned. Gaviria's persistence had outlasted Escobar's resources. December 2nd, 1993. Escobar's finally killed. The end came on a quiet rooftop in Medellin. Acting on a tip, the search block cornered Escobar in a middle-class neighborhood. He tried to flee across the roofs, but was shot and killed. Some say that he was gunned down in a firefight. Others say that he took his own life. Didn't matter. What mattered was Escobar was finally dead, and his death would mark the collapse of the Medellin cartel. Without its leader, the cartel fractured. The fear that had paralyzed Colombian institutions began to lift. Gaviria, after years of living under threat and pressure, had delivered a blow that many thought was impossible. He had defeated a man who had once claimed he could replace the government itself. But even though the Colombian president won, this was a war he really regretted because the cost was simply too high, and things could have gone the other way too.
Quien quiera que él sea, cualquiera que sea su categoría o posición, reciba la correspondiente sanción.
We take a step back to August 7th, 1986. With President Virgilio Barco Vargas taking office and vowing to eliminate the Medellin cartel. Now, he didn't know that this mission would destabilize his government and almost cost him his life. So the main goal of President Barco was to extradite the cartel's leadership to the U.S. But the cartel's leadership saw extradition as their worst nightmare. In the U.S., they would be stripped of their local power, denied access to their networks, and forced to face a long prison sentence with no special treatment. You see, for them, being sent to the U.S. was far worse than death. The decision to revive extradition enraged Escobar and his allies. They viewed Barco as a direct threat to their survival, and so they responded, not with negotiators nor political pressure, but with extreme violence. Just 3 months after Barco takes office, Cartel sends a clear message. November 17, 1986, Colonel Jaime Ramirez Gomez, key anti-narcotics police commander and fierce opponent of drug trafficking, was assassinated in Bogota. He'd been one of the few security officials who dared to challenge the cartel's operations. His killing wasn't only a personal blow to the administration, but also a warning shot to anyone who might support Barco's policies. Yet, instead of stepping back, the president responded by increasing coordination with U.S. law enforcement and intel services. For Barco, extradition wasn't just a policy, it became a central weapon in a growing conflict. What followed over the next 4 years was a campaign of violence that would spread across every layer of Colombian society. The cartel launched a calculated strategy of fear. They would bomb government buildings, planted explosives in crowded public areas, assassinate their journalists, and systematically target anyone associated with the government's anti-drug operations. One of the cartel's most infamous methods was the phrase plata o plomo, silver or lead, meaning that you either took a bribe or you died. Under that brutal system, judges were killed, prosecutors vanished, and police officers were gunned down in broad daylight. On February 4th, 1987, the government secured its first major victory. Carlos Leder, one of the founding members of the Medellin cartel and mastermind behind many of its smuggling operations, was captured in a high-risk raid. Now, Leder had been instrumental in creating air routes that allowed tons of cocaine to reach U.S. shores. His arrest was a significant blow to the cartel. Barco approved his extradition almost immediately. Leder was shipped off to the U.S., where he received a life sentence, and that message was pretty clear. No cartel member was beyond the reach of justice. However, while the capture of Leder was a success, the cost was severe. Cartel quickly retaliated because on December 17, 1987, Guillermo Cano, the editor-in-chief of newspaper El Espectador, was assassinated. Cano had spent years using his platform to expose the influence of drug money in Colombian politics. Although he wasn't a politician nor law enforcement official, the cartel still considered him a threat, and as the violence increased, so did the government's response. Barco's administration stepped up raids, carried out mass arrests, and froze assets linked to the drug trade. Entire networks of cartel operations were exposed and dismantled. Still, the Medellin cartel refused to back down. Again, they adapt quickly, using car bombs, suicide attacks, and targeted assassinations to fight back. Colombia's major cities, especially Medellin, Escobar's stronghold, became war zones. We go to July 6, 1989. The cartel carries out one of its most brutal attacks. Antonio Roldan Betancourt, the governor of Antioquia and a vocal supporter of the extradition policy, was killed in a car bomb in Medellin. The attack killed several others and sent a brutal message again. Even the most powerful government figures could be eliminated. You see, for many Colombians, this was a moment that confirmed the nation was in a full-scale war with cartel. President Barco responded by further militarizing anti-drug operations and granting security forces more resources and broader powers. That same year, Colombia experienced the highest murder rate in its history. Thousands of civilians were caught in the crossfire. Streets were no longer safe. Explosions became just a routine part of daily life. The public grew weary and frightened. But Barco remained committed to the mission. He believed the state had to show strength, even if the consequences were severe. Now, by the end of his term in August 1990, Barco had left behind a battered but determined state. The Medellin cartel wasn't destroyed yet, but it was weakened and cornered. It was the first time any Colombian president stood up to this criminal organization, and the cartel showed how brutal they could be. Many years after Barco, this next president will commit to the same battle, and things are going to get even uglier.
We have sacrificed more than 1,500 policemen. That's a fight we've been in the last 3 years. They've killed the best of our journalists. They are killing most of the judges.
In 1998, President Andrés Pastrana of Colombia decided to continue the war against the cartels with a firm belief that he could win. The decision would define his presidency for better or worse. Now, in the late 90s, Colombia was a country still trapped in a cycle of bloodshed, corruption, and fear. Cartels had carved deep scars into the nation's fabric, and violence had become an everyday reality. Cocaine production was at its peak, and guerrilla fighters had become business partners with drug lords. In 1998, the government had just lost control of large parts of the country. Whole regions were governed not by law, but by fear. Pastrana takes office at a time when two dominant drug cartels, Medellin and Cali, had lost their original leaders, but their structures hadn't disappeared. Instead, new and smaller cartels like Norte de Valle had filled the vacuum. These emerging syndicates were more scattered, but just as violent. And at the same time, left-wing rebel groups like Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia or the FARC had fully integrated into the cocaine economy. These guys taxed coca crops, guarded cocaine shipments, and used the money to fund their long-standing war against the Colombian state. The numbers reflected the reality of what was happening. In 1998 alone, Colombia recorded more than 23,000 murders. Kidnappings were just common. Bombings and targeted assassinations occurred every other day. For most Colombians, justice was either missing or just controlled by whoever had the most guns and cash. The state, in many areas, barely existed. It got to the point where the Attorney General admitted defeat and said fighting the cartel was just useless.
The Attorney General, who succeeded the one who was killed last year, says that trying to fight the cartel is useless, that you have to just legalize the cocaine and that you have to negotiate with them.
Pastrana came from a political family. His father, Michel Pastrana, had also been president. Andres himself worked as a journalist and a politician, so he was no stranger to the dangers Colombia faced. But unlike many before him, he wanted to try something different. He believed that negotiation with the rebels and a serious crackdown on the drug trade could move the country toward peace. But that meant directly confronting both the guerrillas and the cartels. It was a pretty risky strategy, one that would anger some of the most dangerous players in Colombia's underworld. Only weeks into his presidency, in September 1998, Pastrana began peace talks with the FARC. His goal was to reduce their power by ending the armed conflict. He had hoped that a peace deal would not only stop the violence, but also cut off the FARC's involvement in the cocaine business. However, that move was seen as a major threat to the drug cartels. FARC played a major role in cocaine production, especially in remote areas, so weakening the guerrillas through peace talks meant interfering with the drug economy, and the cartels are not going to ignore this. Soon after these peace talks began, violence increased. FARC launched attacks on police and army posts in rural areas. Smaller cartels targeted mayors, judges, and police commanders who supported Pastrana. In 1998 alone, Colombia experienced almost 1,800 terrorist incidents. Many were blamed on the FARC, but others clearly had cartel support. It quickly became obvious that the peace talks were being used by the rebels to regroup and rearm. Rather than moving toward peace, countries slipped further into chaos. Then in July 1999, Pastrana announced a new plan, his most aggressive move yet. It was called Plan Colombia and developed in partnership with the U.S. This multi-billion-dollar program was designed to fight drug trafficking, restore order, and just help Colombia recover. So the U.S., under President Bill Clinton, saw Colombia as a critical front in the war on drugs. Washington pledged over $1.3 billion in aid, mostly in military equipment, training, and support for anti-narcotics operations. By early 2000, Plan Colombia was in full motion. Military units trained by the U.S. began spraying coca fields in Putumayo and Caquetá, regions dominated by both FARC and the cartels. Thousands of hectares of coca plants were destroyed. Cocaine production began to fall, by some estimates as much as 11% in the first year. The military would launch their raids, arrest traffickers, and seize cocaine shipments. In 2000 alone, Colombia forces captured over 30 metric tons of cocaine. But the cartels wouldn't sit back quietly. They fought back hard. FARC ambushed military convoys, bombed highways, and kidnapped soldiers. In March 2000, a car bomb exploded in Bogotá, killing 12 people. Cartels like Norte del Valle, led by dangerous figures such as Diego Montoya, targeted prosecutors, police officials, and journalists. These acts were not random. It was all meant to send a clear message. No one was safe, not even in the capital. On August 7th, 2002, after an ongoing war with these ruthless cartels, Pastrana's term ended with tens of thousands of his citizens dead.